Hello everyone, and welcome to today's webinar on creating a simple TracerPlus inventory application with Barcode and RFID. I am your presenter, Joe Kraebel, and I am a mobile solutions architect here at PTS. All right. What we want to show today is basically creating a few inventory type applications, one utilizing barcode technology, and another one utilizing RFID technology. That way we'll show you how easy it is to take mass scans of items using RFID technology. All right, so you'll see that we can you can create custom mobile inventory apps with no programming. It's affordable, fully customizable, and easy to integrate. So why mobile? Why TracerPlus? It integrates into many back-end databases and systems, so you're able to take data collected with these mobile devices and then sync that data to and from many types of backends, including Microsoft Access, SQL Server, MySQL, Oracle, pretty much any ODBC compliant database, as well as Excel workbooks and text files. TracerPlus also offers an easy-to-use form design tool utilizing our TracerPlus DESKTOP software. So it's a nice drag-and-drop environment for creating how your form will look on the device, as well as creating the certain attributes and variables involved with the actual app. TracerPlus offers powerful and flexible features from the very simple, barcode scanning to the more complex of utilizing conditional logic. So you can do if-then type statements drafted in our little conditional logic dialog box. You can also deploy to a wide variety of devices, supporting Android OS, Windows Mobile and CE, and iOS definitely coming this year, possibly Q2. All right, so you can design mobile inventory applications for a wide variety of uses. So you can create inventory cycle count apps, inventory issue and receive apps, inventory reordering, so you can check stock levels, and when they hit a certain level, you can have something automatically reordered by sending out an email. You can also do inventory pick and pack type applications, where you're picking and packing product against an order. And as I mentioned before, we can do rapid inventory with RFID, as well as many more. All right, so how do you get started designing your mobile inventory apps using TracerPlus? So we have a few options to get started. The one option, if you don't have much time or don't see yourself wanting to learn the software at all, there is the session setup service we offer. So that's where we take a spec from you, create a statement of work, and then quote based off of that, and then create the application for you, deliver that to you, and then set that up and get you running. So that's one option. Another option is utilizing our online solution center. So that's an online repository of pre-built apps that are free to download and use. So I'll show you today actually some of the apps we have in the inventory category. So that's one way you can get started quickly. We also have training videos as well as webinars such as the ones you're attending today. So these training videos can be general getting started webinars, feature focused webinars, or even full detailed on a specific TracerPlus feature. And lastly, we also offer training services. So with our fast track training, you can purchase in 2, 4, and 8-hour blocks. We can get on the phone with you. We'll create a go-to-meeting so we can screen share and be able to kind of train you on how to use the software, as well as walk you through kind of how to create your app. And before we get started, I just want to mention that if anyone does have any questions at any point during the webinar, please type them into the question panel and we will address those at the conclusion of the demonstration. All right. So now we'll begin the actual demonstration. So I'm going to show my other monitor here. So we're first going to start with the TracerPlus desktop software. So this is a free download, free to use. You only register the mobile devices that you're going to be collecting data with. So we're presented with a few options here. We can start a new project, open an existing project, or choose from our samples, which is that online solution center that I was talking about earlier. So if we click the samples, we'll see we have different categories we can choose from. You have your asset tracking, inventory control, inspections, route accounting, and so on, as well as some miscellaneous that don't really fall into those categories. So just so you know, TracerPlus isn't just geared towards inventory. We're just kind of focusing on that aspect of it today. But you can pretty much do anything with it where data collection is needed. So let's go to the inventory control tab. So we'll see we have about 10 to 15 apps in here. Some are designed for specific devices as they have certain screen sizes and also the lack of a touch screen. But most of these, or all of these apps should work on Windows Mobile and Android. And if you do happen to download an app designed for Windows Mobile, once you deploy that to an Android device, it will actually auto-scale to the width of that device, so you won't have to redesign your form. All right, so the form we're going to look at today is the inventory control Android sample. This is also included in the Android sample apps when you first install TracerPlus to an Android device. So let's go ahead and hit next. And then you can give it a project name if you don't like the one given and save to a different location. Once we hit finish, this is now going to be imported into the desktop software. And you'll see that we have a single session here called inventory scan. So a session is basically a form with a data table behind it, and TracerPlus supports up to 32 different sessions. So you could run 32 different applications on a single device at once. So we'll see in inventory scan we have a few fields here configured. We have an inventory handler, a part number, a part name, where the part's located, the quantity, the description, and then the date scanned. And if we jump over to the form designer, since this was designed for Android, it's going to be a larger form in desktop. So you can pretty much make it look as nice as you want. You can use images, logos, you can change fonts on text, labels, and fields, as well as change any types of colors. So that's what the form's going to look like. So to deploy this to the device, we're just going to click this Build Deploy option. Typically, we use the MTP method, which is a standard protocol for Android connectivity. So we're going to click Deploy, and deploy to my connected device here. And that should push over to our handheld. And then using a free tool from Chrome called Visor, I'm able to actually remote in and control this device. So this is what it's going to look like once it's deployed. So we have our inventory scan icon. So we can also use custom icons for each session. So you'll see this is a custom icon with 3 boxes versus the standard icon. So if we click the inventory scan, we'll see that this form is going to look just exactly like the form that's designed in the desktop tool. So now what we can do is enter an inventory handler. So I'll enter myself here. So now we can scan or enter the part number. Depending on the type of device you're using, if it doesn't have a built-in scanner, clicking this scan button will actually open up the camera scanner. Otherwise, you can use the device's built-in scanner or key it in, which I'm just going to key it in this case. We'll do 1001. We'll give it a name. Call it item 1. Location, we'll say warehouse A. Then we can enter how much or how many we actually counted. So let's say 10. And once I hit enter, that record auto-submits and then brings us back to the scan enter part number field. And you'll also see items in inventory are now 1. If I happen to scan this item again, it's going to actually now look up what we previously scanned, and then it adds a 1 to it. So this is set up to increment each time an item is scanned. So you can either keep scanning the same item over and over again. If you find it 10 times, you can scan it 10 times and it'll accumulate a quantity of 10. Or you can come down here and actually key in a new quantity, hit enter, and that's going to submit. Scan it again, we should end up with 16 as it's going to add the 1 to that 15. And if we scan a different part number, nothing's going to be looked up, so we can enter a new item. Part name is item 2. Say this is in warehouse B, and we'll say a quantity of 50. So now you can proceed to scan all of your items. So if I go ahead and go back here, sorry. So if we go to view data, we should be able to see those 2 records that I just entered. Entered my name incorrectly. But we can kind of swipe this grid over and we can see, you know, date scan, part quantity, where it was scanned, the part name, the part number, and who took the inventory. That's kind of a simple inventory scan type application. So what I want to do is kind of create one from scratch just to show you how easy it is to create something that's fully functional in a matter of minutes. I'm going to go back to the desktop tool and let's create new project. All right, so we want to name the project first. We'll call this inventory scan. We can choose the OS platform. So in this case, I'm going to choose Android since I'm working with an Android device. We also have some other options you can choose from. In the admin area, we have a few things. You can use admin passwords to lock certain things. You can also use user logins. So you can actually have users required to log into TracerPlus before they use it. The launcher screen is customizing how this, if I go back to this, how this screen's going to look. So we have a data entry and a view data tab. So if you don't need users going to the view data tab, if that's where they can actually edit and delete records, you can actually hide that tab. And if you uncheck it, you'll see that it'll just show the data entry tab. We have some connect settings which are related to our data syncing tool, which I'll go over in a little bit just to show you how we can sync data utilizing this tool. Then we're going to jump over to our session. So we want to name our session. Let's call it inventory scan. And now we want to define some fields that we want to capture. So maybe we want a date time, and we will call it scan date. We need a part number. And maybe we just need a quantity. We'll keep it very basic. We'll just do a quick inventory scanning app where we're just going to scan parts and increment quantities. Then we can remove the remainder of the fields. Once we actually name our fields, we can click on a field and then configure some of the various settings available for each field. So each field has a general section where we choose the name, the field type, data type, and if we want to set a default value. So since this is a data type of, since this is a date, we want to set a date time or a data type of date time. Once we do that, we'll see a format button appear where we can actually pick how we want our date time to look. So depending on your region, you may want to display the date differently. So we give you some pre-formatted options to choose from, or you can just manually type into this box using supported characters to make your own format. I'm just going to choose this date. We don't necessarily need a time, so I'll just choose the date. We can also choose to have this be read-only so that it's not editable. Visible means it's going to display on the form, and the show in grid means that it will display on that data view screen, or this column will display on that data view screen. Next is part number. This is just going to be a scan field, so that'll be text. You'll see some other field types here. We support drop-down fields, checkboxes, variable fields, which are fields that we can capture like a device ID or a user who logged in, as well as something we're going to use for our incrementing count. We support signature capture, image capture, math calculations, and radio buttons. So part number, that's a barcode, that'll just be text. And then quantity, like I said, this is going to be a variable field because we're going to want that to increment with each scan. Let's set that to variable. And you'll see that once we set that to variable, we now see a variable options tab. So these are the different variables available to you. It is the user and the device, or what capture the device ID and user logged in. We also support an auto number type field as well as a counter. Custom SQL, we can also use a field to know what type of data was input into another field. So if we wanted to know how the part number was entered, whether it was keyboard or barcoded, we can actually add an input type variable that will actually display how that data was entered. So I'm going to choose increment, and then we can choose what value it's going to start off with and how much it's going to increment by. So if you were scanning cases of 10, you could actually have the increment by set to 10 so that with each scan it goes 10, 20, 30, and so on. So we're just going to start at the 0 with an increment of 1. And then if we go back to part number, the one thing we have to set when using increment is we have to know how to then look up this previous record in order to increment it and then update the record versus just adding a new row for each scan. So that's where this auto find on scan is going to come into play. And we'll set this, depending on if an item is not found once you scan it, we can choose to prompt the user saying, hey, this is a new item. We can just not show a prompt and just add the item. Or if you don't want them to add new items, you can just do a no prompt and discard, and it'll just clear out the field. So I'm just going to do a no prompt add. So that should be it for the increment setup. So now we want to kind of control the flow of the app. So part number, once we scan the part number, we just want to auto submit. So when we auto submit, that's going to go back to this field. This way it allows us to keep scanning a part over and over, submit the record, and keep focus in that part number field to keep scanning. And lastly, we want to control what field the form will start off on when we open it. So that's done via advanced. And we just set our start on field to part number. Since the date time or the date field is going to be auto-populated, we don't need to set focus in that field. So now let's jump over to the form designer. We'll create a default form. So this is what the form is going to look like. We could deploy it now and it would look similar to this. Or we can spice it up a little bit. Like I said, so by default we're sized for a Windows device, but once I deploy this, we should see that it will scale to fit the screen of the Android device. So we can use some of our alignment tools to make the form look a little better. We can actually hide this tab by using the hide tab border option. We set that to true. We can actually extend these fields out a little bit, and then we can move them down. Maybe we want to change the color of the buttons. And maybe we want to change the background color. And we'll just change these labels. Match that. Change the font color to a white. And we can shrink this. And then maybe we want to make this bold. And then we can actually increase its font size to 12 so it stands out a little bit more. And we can also make our buttons bold as well with a bigger font. And we can move these up a little bit. And now if I deploy this to that Android device, we'll see what it looks like. So now we have inventory scan. That's our default icon. So the tab we can actually put off the form a little bit so it shows up a little better. So now another thing I want to show you is how to scale this form to the actual device size. So we do have a list of some supported dimensions in here. I'm not quite sure what this device supports, so let's do 40 by 720. Hit apply, and then that's going to actually scale our form to that size. Now we're just going to shrink this a little bit. Shrink our tab font. We should be good there. And then if we deploy, it should start to look a little better. There. So that's looking a little better. I'm not going to go crazy with it. Let's just start collecting some data. First, let me clear out the original data. Now if we come in here, you'll see it's kind of flashing quickly, but as I'm scanning, that quantity field is actually incrementing. That one just said 5. Scan the new item, that should be 1. Now this should be 2, 3. And now if we were to come back and look at the data viewer, looks like I entered a third item. So we have 5 of the first, 2 of the second, and 1 of the third. That's a quick little simple inventory count app just to scan parts and quantities. And now let's say we want to sync this data over to a database. So the first thing I just need to do here is turn Wi-Fi on this device so we can do a Wi-Fi sync. And what we'll do is move over to our Connect software. So this is a software tool that allows you to sync the data to the destination of your choice. It's very automated. It allows you to sync directly from TracerPlus to this backend. I'm going to create a new project, and we'll create a new, what we call profile. So Connect supports 2 different profiles. One is a sync profile, which is either for batch or Wi-Fi syncing. And then there's a live profile that allows you to utilize Wi-Fi or cellular to transmit this data in real time and see changes added on the fly. We're just going to choose a sync profile here, and then we can actually tie this to our desktop project. So we'll look for that project, inventory scan. and then we'll create the profile. So now we can actually name the profile. In this case, we'll say it's sync from device. So it's a good idea to separate different sync processes into different profiles. So if you're syncing data to the device, it's better if that's in a separate profile versus one that's syncing data from device. So that way you don't have to do them both at the same time, and you have more control on when those syncs actually take place. I'm going to add a process to this profile. So a sync process is just defining a source and a destination, basically taking a source of data and placing it to some destination. So we can call this process sync inventory scans. Our source is going to be coming from the device, so it's going to be TracerPlus. And you'll see since we associated our desktop project, our session is already populated in here, and we can just choose inventory scan. We can choose a destination to go to. So I will do ODBC, and I will sync it to one of our sample tables that come with the TracerPlus Connect. This is just a sample access database with some tables in it. So I'm just going to choose the 5-field sample, which is a generic 5-field table. But if we chose something like asset list, or I think we have something with product issued, product received, that's an inventory type table. You could kind of see the actual table field names in here. But we're going to choose our 5-field sample, and then we just map up the fields down below. We'll say that scan date is going to go to field 1 in the table, part number to field 2, and quantity to field 3. So then if we go to options, we can choose how to post this data to the database. So we can keep adding it, we can override it, or we can update based on some value or values. In this case, we're just going to be appending to it. Actually, you know what? Since we're doing an increment, let's do an update existing, append if not found. So that means that once it syncs to the database, it'll try to update it if it exists. If not, it will add it as a new row. So we're going to update it based on field 2, which is our part number, because that'll be our unique key or field that we would update based on. And on the source side, we have options to remove the data on a successful sync. Since let's say this is going to be our inventory, we probably don't want to remove it from the device, so we can leave that unchecked. You can also add source filtering to only sync data based on certain criteria. Maybe you only want to sync based on a certain location, so you can set up a filter to do that, and even do that dynamically. So there's our sync process to take these inventory scans. So I'm just going to save it, give it a name, call it inventory scan. Now we need to set up the device and tell it how to do this sync. So that's where we were talking about that Connect tab before, or option here. This is where we're going to define how this data is going to be synced. So the first thing we need to do is add a host. So the host is basically where this Connect software is running. So since it's running on my PC, I can put in my IP address here. And then the ports used by default for Connect are 4403 and 4404. So we will just leave that as is. This is telling the device that once we do a sync, this is the host it should be looking out for. We do support multiple hosts. So you'll see once we actually configure a sync button, how you can tie in the host with that. So for the actual sync, there's a few options here. We can actually add a sync button to this form, or you can add a dedicated sync session. Typically, I like to add a separate session for syncing, because that way we can actually put multiple sync functions on this form. So we'll call it sync. We'll go to the form designer, and we'll just work with a blank canvas. So I'm just going to add a button. So this is going to be a sync button. And once we add a button, we have a bunch of different button actions we can choose from. But the one we're looking for is the do sync. So the do sync is what's going to trigger that sync. And then the two properties that are important for this button are the host ID and the profile ID. So once we click this button, we need to tell it what host to sync to and then what profile and connect to sync. So if we jump back over to our connect settings, you'll see that this has a host ID of 1. So that's what we want to set for this button. We set it to a sync host ID of 1. Then we need to tell it which profile and connect should it be syncing. So if we jump to connect, we'll see that each profile here has its own unique ID. So being this is the first profile, it'll be a profile ID of 1. If we had a second profile, it would be 2. So that way, using a button, we can control which profile we want to sync by pressing that button. So in this case, we're syncing profile 1. So that will be the profile ID set here. And we can give it a name, just call it sync, and make it a little bigger. Center it. Let's make the font a little bigger here. There, so now that's set up that when we press the sync button, it's going to try to sync to this host and then sync this first profile, which is set to sync from our inventory scan session to this 5-field sample table. And if we jump over to the data viewer, this is a view of that actual table. So right now there's 0 records in that table. And if we jump to the synchronized page, this is where we can kind of view sync activity that takes place. Let's deploy these changes. So there's our newly added sync button. So now if we go to the sync screen, here's our sync button, and we press the sync button. Android's pretty quick. You probably saw some activity take place in the background there. So it said it's sync 3 of 3. If we come back here and refresh, there's those inventory scans that we just did. So you'll see within a matter of 10 minutes or so, I was able to create a simple inventory counting application and then have that data sync over to an Access database table. So the next thing I want to show you is the RFID portion of inventory using this rapid inventory technique. So this I'm going to show you using a Windows mobile device. It's a Zebra MC3190Z, which I'm showing here using the free My Mobiler tool. Then if we go back to desktop, I believe we may have a sample of this. Let's just check our samples. So we have RFID rapid inventory. I believe this is used, this is more of a SKU level inventory where you're actually counting quantities as you scan like item types. That's not the one I actually want. I'm more looking for something where you walk into a room and then take inventory of what's in that room based on that unique RFID tag ID. So let's see what else we have here. I'm not sure we have anything else. What we can do actually is create a new application for this, although it could be under asset tracking because this is also used a lot in asset tracking. Yeah, so RFID Asset Quick Scan, which is similar, basically an inventory, where you're going to select a location, then scan a bunch of tags, and then post all those queued scans. I will import that. So we have a session here called Scan RFID Tags. Our fields are location, tag ID, which is going to be RFID ID, a date, time, and then a grid count, I believe, is used just to get the count of items scanned. So if we look at the form, here's what it should look like once deployed. And then one key factor for using RFID, one is that the device supports it, and then two, configuring the data capture settings. So we want to make sure that Enable RFID is checked, and then we can actually choose the type of EPC format our tags were encoded in. Typically, this is going to be hexadecimal, but depending on if you get custom printed tags, you may want your tags encoded as your existing asset numbers or something else, where ASCII may actually be beneficial. So I'm just going to leave it as hexadecimal. And then we can set a radio power. 30 is the max, so that will give us max coverage when scanning. If you wanted to dial it in a little bit more so that you weren't scanning items maybe in an adjacent room, you could dial that power down a bit and kind of experiment with that. And then another useful option when doing rapid scanning is adding a smart form rule. So we're going to basically say that on an RFID read complete of the EPC memory bank, we want to place that data into the tag ID field. So that way, as we're rapid scanning, that RFID read is always going to go to the tag ID field. It makes for a quicker transition of products to the cached grid. And if we look at our form, we have a grid here, and we call this a cached grid or a queued grid. So this is where we can actually queue up all of these tag reads. So rather than trying to read items one by one and submitting one by one, we're able to take this data, the location data, the date, time, and every tag scanned, and queue up these rows in the grid pretty immediately. And then when finished scanning, we can do the post scan, which will post all of those records at one time and actually post all the data, included the location and the date. So we'll see here, cache mode is set to true. And then we can actually have the device beep as new items are being added. So as you're scanning a room, you should hear beeping if it's finding stuff. If you find that you're no longer hearing beeps, then you've probably picked up all the items in the room. And if we actually click this ID option to actually show our control IDs, so these are unique controls assigned to each form control. So those are utilized in form logic and also for grid binding. So the way we get this data scanned into these fields into the grid is by binding it. So we'll see that we have a tag ID field. So this should have a binding direction of from control because we want to grab it from the tag ID. And then the tag ID you'll see is control 103, so that's our bound control. Typically, we'd want to clear the control on binding or insert, readying for a new scan. And we also want to require it in the bind so that if no tag is scanned, it won't actually get added to the grid. And this is the field that will actually trigger the binding. And then the source field that we're posting to is tag ID. Location, so I can actually hide this column from view. So in this grid, we only want to see the tags red because we already know what the location is selected. So by setting a column width of 0, we can hide it. Once again, this should be a binding direction of from control, and location is 101. We don't want to clear the control. It's not a key column. We do want to require it in the binding, so that way, if the user doesn't select a location and just start scanning tags, nothing will get added until they actually select a tag, or excuse me, select a location. We don't want this to trigger the binding. That should only be done based on the tag scan. And source field location, date, time, same thing. So we have a date field here off the form. It'll be from control 6. We want to hide the column 0. And then it shouldn't trigger, but it is required. And then what we added here was a grid count field, which we don't actually need. So I'm going to delete that. This was created, I think, in an older version where it required a field control for that. We can actually just add a label control. We'll call it count. And maybe we'll make it pretty obvious. Make it nice and big, bold, maybe a different color. And maybe we want to right justify it, the grid. And then we can tell the grid where to place its record count. So we'll see control 15 is that label I just added. So we'll set record count control to 15. So as we're scanning items, we should see that count increase. So that way it shows how many items we've actually scanned to that grid before posting. Lastly, we have our post scan. So that's just a button action, a grid post. That's basically just going to post the data only that's in that grid. And we tie it to the grid via that control ID. All right, so now let's deploy this over to our RFID device. You'll see there's our scan RFID tag session. So the form looks a little big for this device, so let's go ahead and size it appropriately. It looks like it's set to use full screen mode, but we're not using full screen mode. Let's turn that on. So full screen mode will hide the start bar up top, or I think the title bar up top, to give you a little bit more room for your form on smaller screen devices. So now we shouldn't have any scroll bars when we go into this form. First thing we do is select a location from our drop-down, and then we can just press the trigger in the RFID gun. And I don't know if you can hear that, but it's beeping as I'm reading a bunch of tags in the office here. So you'll see that count's going up. It's counting pretty quickly. So in a matter of seconds, I read 84 items. Now what we want to do is post these scans. So I click the post scan. And just like that, we posted 84 records. So if we go to here, looks like we may have had some data in here already. So let's just start this over. I'll delete the existing data. Once again, let's select the location, and let's scan a bunch of tags. And we are reading the EPC bank of the tag. So there we read 61 items. Let's post that data. And if we exit and go to our view data, we'll see 61 records. All records have that room 101 along with the date time. But then we have each of our unique tag scans here. So that's a very quick way to RFID a room, or RFID inventory a room, versus picture having to scan 61 items in a room via barcode. One, the barcode may be not readily accessible, so you got to kind of position the item appropriately just to scan the barcode, and then have to do that 61 times versus RFID. You don't really need line of sight. You can just kind of wave the gun around the room. Depending on the tags and what they're placed on, will vary, how far you'll be able to read the item. But it certainly will be miles quicker than, doing a barcode scan. So one other thing with RFID is the ability to also read the user bank. So if we go back to data capture, so what we can do is add another smart form rule for RFID read complete, and then the value can be user bank. And what we want to do is add a new field. We'll say user. That way we can have the user bank always read to this user field. We don't need to trigger an after scan in this case. And then we have an option to read at user memory during scan. So this means that every time we read a tag, it's going to read the EPC and then also read the user bank if there's any data, and then place them into the appropriate field. Then we can add this field to our form. It doesn't have to be visible, but if we wanted to, we could stick it down here. We'll just set that to user, which it already is. We'll see that's control 16. So then let's add that to our grid. So we'll add another column, call it user. Maybe we do want to see this in the grid. We'll do 100 binding direction from control. Bound control is 16. Clear control, we could. It's not a key column. We can require it, so that way it will only read tags that have data in the memory bank into the grid. Triggers binding. This is a little tricky, so I'm not quite sure. We may need to play around with this, whether the EPC or the user will actually trigger the binding. Let's try it based off of the EPC first, and then we just set this to user. And we can also move this up under tag ID. And let's deploy this. While this is deploying, so those aren't familiar with RFID tags, they do have several memory banks. They have the EPC value, which is usually the value read when you interrogate the tag. And then they also have the user memory bank, which is usually an expanded bank to store additional information. Sometimes it's larger than the EPC, sometimes it can be smaller, or sometimes, depending on the tag, it may not even have one. There's also the TID, or the tag ID, which is a unique ID given by the manufacturer. That's something that I don't believe is modified at all, but is something you can read, however, not in TracerPlus. We only support the reading of the EPC and user banks so far. I believe there's also a password or a kill bank where you can lock tags and prevent them from being, read again or rewritten to and such. All right, so let's see what this is done. Oh, no. So yeah, it looks like I have a few tags here that have a user bank. So you'll see that they're adding to the grid. I've read 6 items with user data. So it looks like we have a few windshield tags that I think had VIN numbers encoded to them. So it read that user data along with the EPC, and we can post those scans. We should end up with, I believe, 67 if we scroll down to the bottom. One thing we'd probably need to do is display our user field in the grid, so we can enable that show in grid and just redeploy. And if we go back to view data, go down to the bottom, we should now see those last 6 rows with that user bank data. And depending on the user bank size will depend on how much info you can actually write to that bank. So some people, for inventory purposes, you may write like an EPC or unique ID to the EPC value. And then in the user bank, you may want to write the actual item UPC. So that way you could have uniquely tagged items, but like UPCs, you can actually count inventory based on those like UPCs recorded in the user bank. That would probably be a good use for RFID inventory counting based on SKU. So that's pretty much what I wanted to show you today of how you can quickly get started doing inventory with TracerPlus using either barcode or RFID technology, as well as the ability to set up syncing of data to a database or of some sort. I'm just going to pull up our last slide here. We'll start addressing some questions asked during the presentation. But if you do have any questions at any point after the webinar, feel free to contact us at the information here, as well as check out our YouTube page for training videos, as well as follow us on Facebook and Twitter. I also want to mention that TracerPlus is available for free trial, so all the products I showed today are available for free trial. So TracerPlus Desktop is a free download. TracerPlus Connect is a trial, and the only limitation is it will sync 5 records at a time. But other than that, you can fully set it up and test functionality if you have a device. All right, so if anybody has any questions, please type them into the question panel. So info on pricing can be found under the pricing section. So like I said, desktop is free. You only license the devices that you're using TracerPlus on, as well as the number of connections needed for syncing. And these are the list pricing for the different versions of the software, and volume discounts are available. And if you wanted to see the differences between the standard and pro version, you can come to our feature matrix here. It gives you an overview of what's supported in standard versus TracerPlus Pro, as well as what may be supported in only Windows or Android, as some of the features are only supported on a specific platform, but most are supported on both. And I also want to mention that you can view our compatibility list here of the different devices that we've tested or have heard from customers that they have successfully used TracerPlus on. If your device isn't on the list, doesn't mean it doesn't work. It just means that we haven't tested it yet, or we haven't heard from a customer using this device. So since we're available for free trial, you can try this on any device you have to see if it actually works. So we had a question on the free product from Chrome that we used to view the Android phone. So that was Visor. So we go to Chrome. So I believe it's just an add-in to Chrome. So if you search for Visor, spelled V-Y-S-O-R, I believe the second link, no, not the second link. It is the first link. Yeah, the first link allows you to add this to your Chrome as an extension, and then you can just launch the app from the apps by clicking this Visor, and then connect the device. The device does need to be, or doesn't need to have USB debugging enabled in order to use that tool. And we have found it is a little finicky with some devices, so it may not work with all devices. But so far, I've been able to use it on this CypherLab RS30 and my Samsung phone. And for the Windows utility, it was something called MyMobiler, and we actually allow you to download that from our website under third-party utilities. MyMobiler also supports Android, but that seems to be a little bit more difficult to get to work versus the Visor. So we'd recommend trying Visor first. All right, well, looks like we don't have any further questions. So I want to thank everyone for attending today's webinar, and I hope you got a lot out of it and how TracerPlus can help you with your inventory needs or possibly any other needs that are, not necessarily just inventory related. So keep an eye out for further webinars like this. I believe we're going to be doing a different type of application for the next webinar. So stay tuned for that email. So thanks everyone for joining, and enjoy the rest of your day.